welcome to CRF's podcast series, Chintan Speaks. This edition, we bring an interactive session on global climate governance and its implications on India's climate action. COP30, as we all know, has been concluded recently in Belém, and this was the 30th edition of COP conferences, and that marks the 30 years of global annual conferences that has been happening. It was in Belém, Brazil, and Brazil happens to be an important country when it comes to the climate change regime because Rio Convention, the Mother Convention on Climate Change, was negotiated and adopted in Brazil. So this year's outcome document, very interestingly called as Global Mutirão, so which is a local word for a global document and also signifies the collective efforts that is required, the collective action as we all speak whenever we speak of climate change and the climate action. So a very interestingly named document, and today along with my colleagues Akanksha Jain, Malirai Chaudhary and Omkar Dhanke, we will be unpacking what it actually what is the significance of this document, what it means when it comes to the on-ground implementation, and also in context of India's climate action journey. So, having said that, we all know that COP30 was set to achieve a very wide range of agenda. It was built as the implementation COP, very rightly so, because it was supposed to deliberate on adaptation, two important pillars, the global goal on adaptation and another, the adaptation finance. And along with that, it was also strived to get the implementation stock of the first GST, which was concluded in Dubai in COP28. So with this wide range of agenda, so now is the right time to see whether the COP30 has actually walked the talk, actually delivered what it was set to deliver, and its significance further.
Yeah, so Pooja, as you mentioned, the naming of this entire presidency package is very interesting. So when we say Global Mutirão, it's a very hopeful and collective framing. But on the other side, if we see day two of the COP saw protesters, which was majorly indigenous communities who barged into the blue zones, and the main issue that they highlighted was that they do not feel heard, or they hold no power over the climate action which happens, but it involves their lands and their rights. So I see there is a deep disconnect when we talk about the rhetoric and the reality, which also makes me think, what kind of implications does this have for the durability and the legitimacy when we talk about such concepts, when we talk about, such outcomes? Do they risk being top to down instead of the opposite? And also, do we ignore the indigenous wisdom in this process?
I see what you mean, and building on this idea of global Mutirão, COP30 actually agreed on this new system of supporting fair and equitable transitions. And just so we all know, just transition means making sure that as we shift to greener and cleaner energies and economies, we make sure that no community, no workers, and no regions, no geographies are left behind. It's about ensuring fairness, about redistributing the benefits of the transition, and protecting those who might otherwise, be left out. So with that in mind, COP30 created what's now being called as Belém Action Mechanism, which was largely spearheaded by the G77 and China. And interestingly, EU also floated a very similar idea. And what really stood out, I think, in the final text is that it explicitly mentions meaningful participation, and under that banner they also for the first time included indigenous communities, especially the African descent. And I think that's a pretty big shift in who actually gets recognized in global climate decision making. And as you all know, and for our viewers at CRF, we are also driving conversations about the paradox of energy transition. And globally, as we know, most conversations still revolve around shutting down coal plants and supporting formal coal workers. But what this misses is the tertiary ecosystem around coal that is have a very micro view of it. Let's say the local dhabas, the kirana shops, the repair shops, and these weekly markets whose quite literal operations rely on the formal coal companies and the plants. So these people that I just mentioned, they are not on the company's payrolls, but their tertiary presence has a very huge impact. And unfortunately, right now, they are not being involved as part of the transition story and barely acknowledged in any of the roadmaps, be it global or even domestic. I think that is something we should ponder about a lot.
So, Meheli, I was wondering, building on what you just said, as we transition away from fossil fuels to cleaner tech, are we sort of shifting our burdens from the fossil fuel, coal, and these systems to minerals? Are we swapping our dependence to that sector?
I think that's a very interesting pivot. Yeah, definitely. As we slow down the pace of fossils, then we are simultaneously increasing the demand on energy transition linked critical minerals, which is essentially just adding another layer of dependency.
Right.
And in this vein, for the first time, COP30 actually brought into this just transition conversation, into this rhetoric, this idea about involving the risks that are emanating from, let's say, the entire value chain of critical minerals, that is from mining to processing to refining and every other risk that is embedded within it. The discussion highlighted that the ESG concerns are quite crucial, and this is high time that we talk about it. That is, the areas where the minerals are being mined, to the way they are being processed, under what conditions, and the eventual impact that these have on the communities. So there was a very strong support for ensuring that the communities sitting on these resources should actually benefit. That is through jobs, through local value addition, something which is substantial development. And another interesting point is that they emphasized on rights to a clean and healthy environment, the need for free and informed consent, which is quite important, especially when mining happens on indigenous lands or even protected forest areas. But here's the twist. Even though these issues were discussed in the negotiations, they did not actually make it to the final cut, to the final paper, because as you know, that China blocked the language, stating that critical minerals is not something that has a universally agreed upon definition. So what we got instead was a very watered down paragraph which very vaguely talked about risks, why we need to minimize them, rather than actually stating what these risks are or where they come from. So yeah, I think the truth of the matter here is you can't just talk about just transition while ignoring the very supply chains, the very literal supply chains which power it. And these supply chains are global, they are deeply extractive, they are more often than not, very harmful. And mining expansion, it does not just affect local communities, it affects the ecology they are living in. It accelerates deforestation. It threatens biodiversity hotspots. And yeah, so these are very real risks for real people and local communities.
Thanks, Meheli. In fact, you raised a very important point here about the deforestation. Why it is very much important that, as Pooja also mentioned, about that this COP being more about the adaptation. So, tropical forests particularly are the very rich carbon sinks, and the extent to which they are spread across the globe, covering almost 70 countries, roughly hectares of land around the globe. So they are rich source of carbon sink. Then they harbor a lot of indigenous communities, and therefore their protection becomes very important aspect of adaptation. Given the instances of wildfire raging across this forest around the globe, and therefore all of us should indeed acknowledge and congratulate the COP presidency for coming up with the TFFF fund, that is Tropical Forest Forever Facility. They have announced some of the countries, including the Brazil itself, has announced the fund for this facility. Over the course of time, roughly around 125 billion would be captured for this particular fund. Talking about India, India being has declared itself as an observer for this particular facility. Why it is very much important for a country like India is because India has has acknowledged this particular facility. Why? Because it follows the principle of the Paris Agreement, which is equity, which mentions about common but differentiated responsibility, that historical emitters should pay for their wrongdoings. Then the fund is largely led by a global south country.
Yes.
So indeed it is a very great example of south-south cooperation,
Yes.
which India is leading in its effort as a leader of the global south. And then also, in a way, if we look at the precedent of the previous funds that have been devolved for deforestation, in a way this fund is designed in a way that it is not letting it to become a resort for a carbon offset market.
Right.
So therefore it is giving the in a way, what do we say, advantage for preservation or more than restoration. And for a country like India, when it is acknowledging such a fund, the credibility comes from its action. If you look at particularly at India, we have announced in our INDCs that we will create around roughly 3 billion tons of equivalents of carbon sink. Then we have multiple schemes running across Green India Mission. We have dedicated fund for afforestation.
Yes.
So therefore the credibility of India comes from its actions. Having said all of that, but as always, there are few caveats to any particular mechanism or facility or fund for that matter developed in these international negotiations. This fund is not a exception to that. If you look at the design of this particular facility, it in a way displays some of the loopholes this facility is vulnerable to, particularly the funding mechanism. Just 1/4 of it is being initially pledged by the countries, and that too on the voluntary contributions. The 3/4 of it is based on the market support. As long as the market support that fund, the investments are pouring into that fund, then and then only
It
the
stays
fund
valid.
is available. That means there is very hard question on the sustainability or stability of that particular fund.
Right.
In addition to that, as I said earlier, that we have a long list of such fund existing earlier. Many of them even existed in the legal framework of the UN triple framework.
Triple C, yes.
But then this particular fund lies outside the legal framework of the UNFCCC. And then when those funds which were in the legal channel were not able to meet their stated objectives, it makes a very much question mark on the stability and future of this particular fund.
Yeah, the fact that it's not binding.
Yes. Still, we should, in a way, acknowledge and appreciate the effort of this country, even when the fund has not made its way into the final text of the COP negotiations.
Right.
Yeah.
So, picking threads from that, another big thing that everybody thought, is going to make to the final text, it captured a lot of eyeballs this year, is the fossil fuel phase out roadmap. So, it was discussed at length, but it did not, see the final light. It was not mentioned in the final text. So, this fossil fuel phase out roadmap, it was not initially on the agenda, but President Lula had pushed heavily for that. And even in the world's leaders summit, he framed it as a moral and strategic need. So, and there are also reports that this was not spontaneous at all. Brazil, before their COP meetings and everything, they were in consultations with Beyond Oil Gas Association, and they'd already drafted most of this roadmap. They already had outlined what they want to do. So, they directly came up with that, and gaining momentum from other nations, especially EU, Colombia. And once the momentum was strong enough, they directly floated it into the negotiations. So, which was not taken well, obviously, by a lot of countries. Even though 80 countries agreed to it, to the roadmap, there were a lot of countries which also outright disagreed to it, which include India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So naturally, all of this descended into a lot of chaos. The presidency also tried to make separate huddle groups, compartmentalizing people into discussing this. But finally, this text could not, this entire framing could not be in the final text. As a, even as a face saving compromise, Brazil and Colombia have now also announced that mid next year they plan on organizing something outside the UN setup, a conference which would deal with this kind of roadmap.
Okay, I have a question
Yeah.
here. Taking from what you said, can we state here, rather, can we extrapolate to the fact that they're clearly the two blocks, I think we can all agree to that.
Right.
One that is very serious about climate action, and the one where you're still depending on fossils. Your thoughts?
Right. So, while this might on the surface look like, it's a two clear blocks, one very climate conscious and others who are not, but we also have to understand the strategic and the geopolitical intent behind such roadmaps, right? So, definitely, in my opinion, the Latin American nations do benefit from such a roadmap, having built such strong biofuel economies. They do benefit from biofuel and nature credit based markets. Similarly, for the EU, they do also benefit from such a roadmap, and that's the reason they've been pushing for it. For instance, it could be the fossil fuel dependence post the Russia Ukraine war, or the reasons like early mover advantage in markets when it's about clean tech, regulations, and their standardizations. And very nicely, Saudi Arabia and Russia, which were expected petrostates who would refuse to such a thing, very nicely, Saudi Arabia has brought in an important concept to this, where they've said that it's about reducing emissions. And nobody should be able to regulate which source we regulate it from. So that's very important. And Russia and Saudi Arabia have been very strong opponents of this because they've made a point that why their export commodities be singled out. And especially when I see in the Indian context, it makes sense why we would not want to support such a roadmap, even though we obviously want to decarbonize and want to move to the trajectory where we go towards clean tech, reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. It's also important that we maintain the space for our energy security and development while meeting all those goals, right? And also such a roadmap has to be, in my opinion, be rooted in a lot of other things such as financial realism, CBDR, right? Technology access. So we have to see that such a roadmap does not come at the expense of other things. And also, Mehli made a point that not, when we move to clean tech, it's often extractive.
Yeah.
So it does affect communities in other ways. So fossil fuel dependence, we might remove but we might depend on other systems.
Yes.
And that also has to be met with a lot of financial realism.
Indeed, speaking of financial realism, and also you mentioned of CBDR, and
Right.
there was also the mention of blocks. So I just want to come in and speak about the bigger core issue which actually came out of the COP30 conclusion is on climate finance. So climate finance is one of the crucial pillar, because without the financial support, it's difficult to attain the on ground action, climate action. So this is why it has been part of the climate action agenda right from the beginning. UNFCCC and then Kyoto Protocol, and now integrated into the Paris Agreement. Within Paris Agreement, we have mandatory provision, Article 9.1, which provides for the financial flow that has to come from the developed countries to the developing countries, the binaries we were speaking about. And for this binary, there is a historical root to it. These are the very countries which industrialized because of the carbon emissions, heavy carbon emissions, and that's not for a small amount of period. It's 200 years, 2 centuries. And with that, for these developing countries, the additional layer becomes the increased vulnerability because of less financially capable to respond to the kind of climate impacts that are emerging now. And speaking of the post 2020 COP conferences, especially, because that's when the Paris Agreement has been implemented. Baku conference last year, COP29, the major thrust of the discussion was NCQG, New Collective Quantified Goals.
Yeah.
And that's where the target of USD 300 billion per year till 2035 was set up. But the adaptation cost is increasing, as we know, and climate impacts are becoming severe year after year. And very reasonably, developing country want that this target has to be more research informed, more analyzed one, and that's why the demand is for 1.3 trillion instead of the promised 300 billion. Now, collecting from all what has been happened so far in COP30, very interestingly, this wasn't even part of the main agenda of discussion.
Really?
And India especially played a very instrumental role in making as a central piece of COP30 outcome. And in that we see that a roadmap has been established for for ensuring the political accountability of realizing 1.3 trillion target by 2035. So these are the sustained diplomatic efforts of our very own country, and which actually makes sense when we see it from the developing countries vantage.
Here, I would like to interrupt you. Sorry, Pooja, for interrupting, but I have a sort of pertinent question to ask. Is that in any way the global goal on adaptation, is it in any way linked to climate adaptation finance?
Yes, it is, and before answering your question, I just wanted to. I'll come to your question, but I also wanted to speak on the nuances of the climate finance.
Right.
So, climate finance, it's not a monotonous financial instrument. There are layers to it. We all, understand what mitigation is and what adaptation is. When a project is, targeted, or the overarching goal of a project is to reduce carbon emission, that is supposed to be a mitigation-based project. And when it is to build the resilience, it can be, infrastructural resilience, it can be a community resilience, and many other parameters and also nuances, sectoral nuances are added. So the resilience from the climate impact. So that is the adaptation financing. And we see that there is a lot of mitigation favorism when it comes to the allocation of money. So the latest UNEP report, United Nations Environmental Program, has published, they come up with the adaptation gap report, and the latest edition has come in 2025, and that report says around 25.9 billion USD has been allocated for the adaptation financing, and 58.1 billion USD has been allocated for the mitigation finances. You can see the difference, how clear it is. And 57% of the entire financial share, climate finance share, goes for mitigation, and only 28% towards the adaptation. So that is the real gap. And the developing countries, especially India and China, has been very vocal about it right from the Kyoto days. Kyoto has been implemented from 2005 onwards, and even from those days, these countries has been vocal, and also in the Paris Agreement, implementation, they have been very vocal about it. So in 2019, it was the adaptation finance stood at around 20 billion USD. And that's when 2019, as we know, was the COVID year, and the COP conference didn't happen that year. The year next to it, Glasgow conference, which was COP25, during that conference, adaptation finance became the central point of discussion, and it was decided that in the next 5 years till 2025, so from the 20 billion USD, the adaptation finance should scale up to the double of the amount, 40 billion USD. But that did not happen. As I just cited, that the UNEP report says that it stands at 25.9 9 billion USD. So it's half of the amount which was targeted. So there is a clear wide gap. And as the year already mentioned, that 2025 happened to be the the timeline milestone. And this is the very year, and this is why it was one of the discussion agenda for this year's COP. And in the outcome document, there is a mention of that the adaptation financing will be tripled. Yes, tripled. However, this has to be taken with a pinch of salt because there is no base year defined, as it was very unlikely from what was decided in Glasgow. There was a clear-cut base year, 2019, and that's from where the doubling target started, and there was a clear milestone, where it was supposed to be achieved. And now that time frame was for 5 years, and this time the time frame has been increased to 10 years.
Right.
And the very same report which I mentioned earlier, it gives that around between 310 to 365 billion USD is required per year for the adaptation financing, optimum adaptation financing till 2035. This is why I think that the adaptation financing decision at COP30 it lacks clarity. It's a bit vague. And now coming to your question, Omkar, about the global goal on adaptation. Yes, I'll firstly start with what global goal on adaptation actually means.
Heard a lot about this in the press releases,
Yes.
those were coming out.
Yeah.
But then certainly you can link it to the
This term
adaptation finance.
GGA being floated. What exactly does that mean?
Indeed. Yes, so global goal on adaptation, basically it's right now there is no clear cut tangible parameters or indicators to assess the adaptation capacities of respective countries. So at this stage of negotiations, we are negotiating on what clear concrete indicators should to make this assessment feasible. And now we hear a lot that these many number of indicators has been adopted to the decision and all of that. So these are the sectoral indicators. Some are on health, some are on water security. If not water security, basically the availability of water resources, sanitation, and the sustainable human settlement, many other such goals which are being deliberated. It was a 2-year long process. Out of 1,000 indicators, 100 indicators were zeroed down, and out of that 59 indicators has gone into the COP decision, and there is a separate document released by UNFCCC on these indicators. But when you give a closer look, what is when you unlayer the GGA indicators, it becomes evidently clear that the kind of indicators which would need means of implementation, like the financial resourcing, the technology flow. So these kinds of indicators are a bit either diluted down or missing from the COP decision. So yes, GGA and global goal on adaptation and adaptation financing is linked, but in a longer run. At this discussions is more about the indicators, what parameters should be included to make such kind of assessments. And once those assessments would be once the countries would have the clear the clear standing of which country and region is standing where in terms of their adaptation capacity, then the further way forward would be like to better strengthen their adaptation capacity. And that's when adaptation finance comes into the picture. And more of the adaptation finance would be required. And since we are talking about the financing, and the additional layer to financing is the loss and damage fund, as popularly called. So loss and damage fund is the new player in the block, if not kid in the block, the popular CRF term. So it's a new player in the block because it entered from Paris Agreement onwards. There was no loss and damage. There was no such facility either in Kyoto Protocol or in UNFCCC. And this was pushed for by European Union and also by United States for supporting the most vulnerable countries. However, there is a bit of slow down process. It's not been completely operationalized, though some seed funding has been promised in during COP28 in Dubai, but the operationalization is still an issue. And I just want to make a mention to the CRF study. We have recently concluded a study where we have suggested how L&D fund can be operationalized. Yeah, so that's a value addition from our end.
Definitely.
While we're on the topic, since you mentioned USA, I think we have to address the elephant not being in the room. The US stepping back from climate leadership, I think it has left a very real vacuum in the multilateral system.
Right.
For decades, whether people agree with Washington or not, we do know that US is the one that's used to set the pace, whether it was for finance, whether it was for technology or even diplomacy. And when the world's biggest historical emitter, it pulls back, which is also the one with the largest COP delegation. When they take themselves out of the equation, I think the entire architecture of multilateral climate cooperation, it somewhere starts to wobble. And as we have seen, USA has played a very cautious role hitherto in climate negotiations, which has then resulted where there are multiple players now fishing in the pond. There's the EU where and I think because of that, we also don't see a very single coherent center of gravity, which is why we see a very huge impact of coalition politics. Like there's EU trying to lead, but often through these regulatory mechanisms like the CBAM, which a lot of these developing nations see as unfair. Then there's China stepping up in certain areas, trying to drive South-South cooperation rhetoric, but also it's blocking progress in many of these focus and thematic areas. And then there's G77, which is strong, it is assertive, but it is also internally fragmented. And I think that is why this leadership vacuum that has been created, I think this matters because global climate action, it only works when there's shared sense of responsibility and a powerful actor that is willing to push the system and the agenda forward. Without that, negotiations become slow, they become more reactive and definitely very politicized.
So, as you mentioned, these small alliances that are coming up, I can't, I was thinking about BASIC, which is emerging as a very natural alliance of like minded countries. These are not the least developed. This is different from LMDCs if we look at it. So, they have same issues when we talk about the climate and the energy transitions. And naturally, China is also trying to go with it because they are the leaders for clean tech. They obviously benefit from supplying their tech to all of the world and especially to BASIC.
In fact, China used COP30 as a platform to build a diplomatic coalition of sorts by aligning the LMDCs, the African group, and other countries on the trade issue, which was quite interesting. And also interesting to note is that these exact countries are the ones which have been facing the worst of climate impacts, and they're also the ones with the highest or rather the heaviest loss and damage burdens. So this, I think, drives a conversation about not just how we cut emissions, but rather who pays for it and under what trade rules. And I think the message from the global south is quite simple on this. You cannot penalize our exports through trade measures while the loss and damage fund remains underfinanced.
Definitely, yeah.
Certainly, and I should, in a way, appreciate you for bringing that point on the table, especially in the backdrop of carbon adjusted border mechanism that is getting operationalized early next year.
CBAM, right.
It starts 26, right?
Yes, especially in backdrop of that, we have to pay a very detailed attention to what actually got negotiated, got discussed in the COP on the unilateral trade measures. Why? Because it is important that certainly these protectionist measures, which are done through the tariff mechanisms, are in a way very much biased, discriminatory, and not following the principles of the global conventions.
Right.
We are certainly violating the principle of equity of CBDR when such mechanisms are coming into place. And when you just look at the global landscape around this, so the hypocrisy is very much evident, very much clear. If you look at the United Kingdoms, they closed their last thermal power plant last year. After using the coal power for 150 long years, the lifespan of that power plant was around 50 years. And relatively, if you look at the India's thermal power fleet, the average age is around 20 to 22 years. So certainly there is no comparison. And therefore we should certainly be mindful and appreciate what has been come out, and it has been directly mentioned in the COP final text that was being negotiated. It has been reaffirmed that the international economic system should be based on cooperation, should be supportive, should be open to all the parties,
Right.
and especially non-biased, non-discriminatory towards the developing countries.
So, similarly on what you guys just mentioned, it's the core idea on which the bargaining chip of even the fossil fuel phase out roadmap was based. So, the countries who were opposing the roadmap used finance, L&D, CBDR as, actually their bargaining chip, that such a roadmap cannot come up, in the final text unless and until something meets to it. So I think the core idea remains same in most of the discussions that we see here. Another issue that was the highlight of this year, which got greatly politicized, was the climate science. So interestingly, this year IPCC's interventions and its findings could not be endorsed as the best available science. And when we talk about the opposing references, these basically came from the Arab group, which is Saudi Arabia, Iran, India, and those defending the integrity of IPCC include Bangladesh, EU, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So while this might seem as something being a pro science versus anti science take, it's not actually that. It's more like pro science and versus equity in science kind of take. So this also reflects worries when we're not able to endorse IPCC as the best available science. This I think definitely reflects worries about what's the fairness, what's the representation and historical imbalance, when we produce science in a certain way. Because it's not only about the data that we represent, it's also about what kind of data, how is it represented, and, what is the fairness in it, how much reality of a certain local region does it capture, and how much of shared but differentiated responsibilities can it reflect.
Right.
Because ultimately it is this science which drives the flow of finance and technology, because developed nations use it as their chip that to ultimately direct where and how the finance flows. So although there are thousands of scientists working at IPCC, it often skews towards the global north, which definitely creates an impact in the way global south perceives the science that is being reported and presented by IPCC. That is definitely there. Other than that, also there comes a bias, because when global north scientists represent, they often justify and present science in a way that takes stand for their actions, just like we saw in case of phasing out fossil fuels, or even in the case of agriculture,
Even with just transitions.
right? So also, very interestingly, recently before COP, we also had a study at CRF where we also highlighted these data and the entire science around climate does have a very crucial gap, where it does not recognize the FEW nexus, which is the food, energy, water nexus. So the only thing that it does for now is a lot of carbon accounting. So emissions and carbon accounting is mostly where the debates revolve, which really, just ignores the entire nexus point, and wherein, the concept of LCA, which is life cycle analysis, needs to come in.
Let me just add to what you mentioned just right now about the LCA approach. And to substantiate my point, I'll use the example of same where you left the point. I'll just pick up it from there, of the agriculture and food security.
Right.
if you look at the India's approach, India's stance while negotiating, while highlighting the concerns with respect to agriculture and food security, it is very much evident how this particular mechanisms, global mechanisms, show in a way a bit bias.
Right.
And it is also very much evident what Pooja mentioned, that the difference between the adaptation and mitigation, the difference between the finance that is being available.
Right.
If you look at the agricultural landscape for developing countries like India and the Western developed countries, in our case, most of them are, firstly, roughly 50% of population is engaged in agriculture. So in a way, we are an agrarian society. Secondly, 80% of them are small and marginal. That means they are owning less than 2 hectares of land, producing enough just for self-consumption. Vis-a-vis, in the Western countries, the agriculture is largely industrialized. The corn produced in those fields are being pushed into developing markets. So that's the cycle that is going on. So when you look, and when these negotiations take place, and when developing countries like India are asked to follow the mitigation metrics, saying that, hey, you stop your fertilizer consumption to such and such extent, hey, you stop your water consumption to such and such. So this is very much a narrow focused approach. We have to look it as a system. Why? Because also, if you look at India runs probably one of the world's largest food security program. It is feeding roughly 80 crore population, almost equivalent to the population of, let's say, Western Europe. So therefore, we have to be very much mindful of what we need to follow and what we need to exclude, while keeping our own prerogatives at higher instance, and then dealing with the
So like a systemic
Yes,
perspective with
yes.
our national realities.
a holistic approach is
Holistic,
certainly
yeah.
required while dealing with things like agriculture and food security.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, while listening to you, I was reminded of when in 1972 Indira Gandhi was there at Stockholm conference. She told the global north, the developed countries, that for you pollution can be the biggest concern. For me, the biggest polluter is poverty. When you speak of the world's largest food security program, so that reminds me of what she told the global north. And flowing from there on, the developmental trajectory, the you also spoke about the trade flow, the economic transitions. These are all very interlinked, or deeply knit issues with climate action and the overall the resolution to the curbing of carbon emissions, and also building the resilience. So we have, I think, covered majority of issues, if I may say, starting from just transition to fossil fuel. Also spoke about the finance and biodiversity. I'm just wondering, trying to turn through, or think a bit out of the blue, that what and how we should we look at what it paves the way for the outcome document that we have in hand, 192 countries which are parties, and now US being withdrawn, so I will minus that. And how when they go back with this document, how it actually translates into the on-ground action. And as we all know, India has signed up for, applied for COP33 presidency, and next year we will most likely get a go ahead. We are positive about that. So, how do you think about that?
I think this is a very opportune movement to sort of take a step back, zoom out, and see that how all of this actually sets the stage for something bigger. That is what you just last said. India's potential leadership at COP33. What we spoke earlier about the leadership vacuum, I think this is where India is very uniquely positioned, nicely cushioned to step into that role. I believe
Yeah.
we might agree to this
Yes,
as well.
very much.
That,
We showed the leadership at G20.
absolutely. And yeah, I think, we have the moral legitimacy of a developing country.
Of course.
What I like to also say is that we have the diplomatic heft of an emerging major power and a track record of proposing these brilliant alternative discussion spaces. As you said, the G20, the BRICS, and other such, multilateral partnerships. And I think, it is very important to remember that India also sits at the heart of a massive energy transition demand conversation, and COP33 will give India the perfect platform to consolidate that role, that is to set new norms and solidify the voice of the global south by defining what would be the future of COP discussions.
That should also be supported and sustained by the momentum that India is carrying right now.
Yeah.
Right.
How does it carry forwards its partnership with the global south countries? How does it ensure the south-south cooperation?
Right.
Yes.
So when India is likely to assume, I'm using the word likely to assume, hoping that it will assume, it should also ensure that how is the agenda, the priorities,
Right.
the
Right.
concerns, especially the developmental concerns of these global south countries are made visible to the world, are worked upon, and then the outcomes are tailor made, customized to the requirements of this country. As long as India is able to do that, certainly it is the, I think, Vishwaguru, and it can certainly lead the way
Right.
for COP33.
So, when we talk about India and, the vision for COP33, I think definitely, as Maheli mentioned, we have set the precedent for that, that India has been a leader in the climate energy space. Definitely, we can see it through the International Solar Alliance, the Mission Life. So, we have a lot of credibility to account for. And, with COP33 possibly being India's presidency, this is our moment to take up the leadership, set the agenda. And a few areas where I feel, India should step up and start developing its agenda. It should be definitely climate resilient development pathways. Accounting for the global south perspective, incorporating water security, climate justice, biodiversity, ecosystem strengthening, also amongst, the emissions that we always discuss. Also focusing on the biodiversity and the indigenous communities would remain equally important. Additionally, with India's presidency being only 3 years down the line, it's very short a time, and probably India should already start building certain alliances.
Right.
We already saw that we have natural alliances in LMDCs and BASIC. So should we start building those alliances and further our agendas that we want to set? And definitely, I see this as India's chance to also be decolonizing the science, the climate science, and bringing in the Indic perspective to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, very rightly mentioned, Akanksha. You spoke about the alliances, and you also spoke about the on ground actions which are required, not just in terms of the emission reduction, also in terms of building resilience and also biodiversity conservation. So speaking of that, I mean, it has been very sometimes even frustrating for developing countries, because whenever there is a talk about equity, I mean, that's the core concern of developing countries, especially. We only speak in the language of mitigation, in the language of emission reduction, that the equity has to be operationalized. But it has to be operationalized also when it is about adaptation, and that's why GGA, these adaptation indicators become important, because they integrate the respective capabilities of the countries into the final decision. So I mean, having said that, we are about all set to wrap it, and we will of course take the conversation further, maybe at our respective working desks, or in some during some informal
Chance,
conversation in our very famous and very everyone's favorite pantry. So thank you so much for joining us. Any questions, really like to engage in chat box, and do like, share and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
for
much.
listening to us.